Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today I'm talking about the new album from µ-Ziq, 1977. Alright, we're back once again to Paradinas, and isn't this near perfectly timed? He came out with this latest project right as I just finished reviewing the rest of his main studio albums. He's been pretty dang prolific as of late, what with the success of albums in the past 2 years like Scourge, Secret Garden with Mrs. Jinx, and Magic Pony Ride, or the latter's companion EPs Goodbye and Hello, or the gazillion other projects he put out under other aliases such as Tusken Raiders. But less than a year since his last full album, he's already got another new one to follow it up. Though if you were worried that his most recent work was starting to run together a little bit, no need to worry about that, since this latest album is quite a bit different from the usual fare you'd expect out of him. 1977 is notable not just for releasing on a fairly new small-time label called Ballmat, started 2 years ago by Albert Salinas and Philip Sherburne, but more importantly, this is Paradinas' first full album to be almost entirely ambient. It is way more languid and atmospheric than usual from him, with much less in the way of crazy beat work than you'd expect. It will immediately set itself apart as its own thing in his catalog with just one listen, though it's also far from unrecognizable as the same artist. It's still made out of all the same sorts of synth textures and melodic washes that have colored his other recent projects, or even some of the darker, creepier, and more metallic tinges which you might associate more with some of his earlier material, like some of the most downbeat and unpleasant moments on a classic album of his like Tango Invective. Or even some cuts which kinda ended up resembling the likes of his friend Aphex Twin's Selected Ambient Works Volume 2. Now, I'll admit that this wasn't exactly a project that really got to me on like a super deep emotional level, or one that really threw me for a loop aside from the initial novelty of the change in approach. As I've been sitting with it over the past week on and off, it was an album that my feelings didn't really evolve much over time on. I'd pretty much had my thoughts pinned down on it by third listen, and most subsequent listens didn't give me much more to discover or click on an even deeper level. But it also hasn't shrunk on me in all that time either. I've probably listened to the album like 7 times at this point and got pretty much the exact same amount of enjoyment out of it each time. It's an album that flows well and paces itself well without ever running together. There's a lot of variety on display here. For instance, the album starts in really warm and enveloping territory with the opener 4 AM, which surrounds you with all these really nice heartfelt vocal chops, deep synth bass lines, and minimal percussion. The melodies here are really nice and easily memorable in spite of their slight disjointedness. A very easily accessible start to the project. And the idea behind this cut gets progressively warped a bit on the next 2 cuts. Aero, or however you say that, takes a lot of the same melodic vocal synth textures and melts them down to recontextualize them within a much more airy and formless piece, full of more monolithic cloudy pads. And then that flows into Allegro, which is anything but what its title implies, featuring a lot of reverb-covered, high-pitched, screeching synth pads that resemble scraping violin strings with some dissonant, Boards of Canada-ish melodic blips. Now, if you were clamoring for something with a bit more energy, Houzz 13, as you covered, and its mixes of simple, classic deep house beats and various different layers of melodic lines blending over each other to create probably the single most full-sounding cut here. I mean, it's not as full-sounding as his predecessor, Houzz 10 from Shoot Corners, and I haven't heard Houzz 11 or 12 yet. Maybe we'll get to that in odds and ends. But it is definitely the most up-tempo cut on this album, and a refreshing island of more danceable material in an ocean of spookier ambient material. Very consistent favorite on this project. And another consistent favorite was Belt and Carpet, one of the biggest growers here. At first I wasn't quite sure what to make of all the spooky little minimal arpeggios and barely present thumping percussion. It's a very sparse-sounding track, but also conveys an interestingly chilling sense of open space, and the melodies, as minimal as they may be, are among the most easily memorable here once again. One of those tracks that could act as like a movie soundtrack cue, but the kind of which that could maybe like stick out to you as cool while you were watching the movie. And while we're on the topic of the most memorable cuts here, Marmite is one of those tracks that sticks out like a sore thumb and you're never going to not notice when it starts. Not to the point of feeling out of place or like clashing with the tone of the rest of the album, but its mixes of intense buzzing bass don't sound like anything else here. It sounds like you're hearing the auto-tuned version of like some kind of power equipment running, like a lawnmower, electric saw, or a leaf blower or something, except the slight changes in its sustained pitch that might otherwise feel like a random result of its distance away from you actually feel like they have a direction and some dramatic tension aided by the airier chords surrounding it. Meanwhile, Asda takes the exact same percussion patterns from Belt and Carpet and repurposes them into a track that is a lot less melody and a lot more unnerving spookiness. Definitely one of those moments that reminded me of Aphex Twin's old ambient work and brought tracks like Radiator and Windowsill to mind. Though there is also some cool progression here with a little bit of an off-kilter and dizzy melodic loop being introduced partway through. And if you wanted the idea behind a track like this to go even further, there's Zolbe 3, which unfortunately doesn't have much in common with Zolbe 2 from Tango Invective, aside from maybe being the same tempo. Instead, taking the low-key percussion pattern from Belt and Carpet and Asda, stripping it down even further to some slight metallic tapping, and putting all these random buzzing and scraping effects over it that I guess kind of mirror those on Marmite, except there's not really a sustained pitch so much as it just sounds like scraping something metal on concrete. I don't know. Still a nice track, and there is some warmer bass and barely present melodic textures introduced later, but it is definitely one of the tracks where my attention was most likely to trail off. Though in between Asda and Zolbe 3, there is a markedly stronger cut in the title track. It's Alpha collab with Paradinas' significant other µ-Ziq. This track may not have much more than a sparse mix of unnerving looping synth sequences and some chilling choir pads for a bit extra texture that doesn't really evolve over time in any way and can maybe get a bit repetitive. This was probably the track that grew on me the most the more I listened to this album. I do think it stands out as a unique moment in context and makes for another one of the more sonically striking cuts here, even if its appeal might be more subtle. Granted, after all these tracks that go for something more unnerving, you might be itching for the more accessible melodies to return. So next we get Burnt Orange, a track which may take a bit to fully reveal itself, but ends up in way more immediately welcoming and comforting territory than any of the 5 tracks that preceded it, in its slow-building mixes of emotional MIDI pianos, soft synth arpeggios, and more vocal synth pads, even bringing in some slightly jazzy down-tempo drumming near the end for good measure. I also quite like how this track is slightly contrasted with the following cut, Lime Aero, I suppose the sequel to Strawberry Aero from Skrillex, which happens to be a significant improvement in my eyes. It features all this reverb-soaked, minimal TR-808 percussion, which vaguely reminds me of Aphex Twin's Tha, but going over these airy pads and quirky melodic blips which give the track a slightly different, more chilling flavor. Definitely another one of the more consistent highlights in spite of its comparative subtlety. Though subtlety isn't as much the name of the game for following track, Reference Gravy, which is way more likely to wake you up, and its more dramatic mixes of MIDI harp plucks, rumbling bass, tense chords, and super upfront and breathy vocal synths, intoning about the letter that comes before F. It may once again not feel out of place and still fit with the tone of the rest of the project, but there is still a pretty noticeable jump in intensity here, kept up in a very different way on Mesolithic Jungle, which of course hits you with a lot of filtered jungle breakbeats running underneath its thicker build of pads. The breakbeats are never all that upfront like they might be on the stuff he did for Magic Pony Ride. They're always rather distant sounding to still fit with the theme, but they still deliver that rollicking energy you want out of a track of this style. Then finally, after a mostly forgettable collection of melodic pads and pillowy, we reach the ending, Froglets, a closer that kind of mirrors the easy accessibility of the opener, and one that I suspect will be sticking with fans longer term. The lead synths on this one may be a little treble heavy and the mix isn't as full sounding as it could be, but the mix of those catchy lead melodies going over some slightly more hip-hop flavored beats and the grooving down-tempo bass lines, it's a really satisfying finish to the whole project. And yeah, that's everything on 1977. I'm not gonna say this album totally floored me or anything, but it is definitely one of his better projects in this later period of his career, one that I'm definitely going to be more likely to remember. In the grander scheme of his catalog, this sits in a similar tier to a project like Duntusborn Abbott's Soulmate Devastation Technique, where maybe you're not going to get some of his all-time best material, but there is a unique idea driving the whole project and a very clear, easy-to-pin-down identity that it has that none of his other albums have. And I would say this is definitely a better project than Duntusborn Abbott's. Roughly as consistent in terms of my personal enjoyment, though the individual tracks on this one are a lot easier to tell apart and remember what they sound like from a distance. So, I guess take that all as you will. It's yet another very solid offering from Paradinas as to be expected, and matching the album's title, incidentally, this can just get away with a 7.7 out of 10. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters, they're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list, link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.